Welcome to the Mind Body Connection podcast for sports. My name is JC Boyle.
And my name is Skylar Myris.
We're so glad you're tuning in. Today's episode will be an introduction to our series, including a rundown of some key topics that we'll be covering.
Today, we'll start by going over what the research says about restrictive diets and how the body may be impacted before narrowing our discussion to the impact of a restrictive diet on female athletes. Our research includes data on both youth and adult groups, restrictive diets and eating disorders, and differing skill and performance levels.
For the purposes of this podcast, restrictive diets will typically refer to both inadequate diets and eating disorders. And to further clarify, diet is indicative of a pattern of eating, and an eating disorder is not a diet, but we will be referring to the diets of those with eating disorders.
So one of the main triggers we see in eating disorders is related to sports and early involvement for the youth. So when we look at female athletes in college, we might be able to assume that they've started eating disorder tendencies when they were younger, and some of them might have been carried into college.
So typically when we're referring to disordered eating behaviors, we're talking about things like restrictive eating or fasting, skipping meals, but they can also include purging behaviors like laxative, diuretics, overeating, purging, and taking dieting pills.
Alrighty, so now we're going to be looking at some research surrounding restrictive diets. Ashna Habib et al. Shared some of the most common short-term consequences of restrictive diets, including dysfunctional hunger cues, dysfunctional hormones, mood swings, heightened depression and anxiety, trouble focusing, and trouble sleeping or sleeping too much.
So when we're restricting our diets incorrectly, you're starving the functions that you rely on from day to day. And the cumulative nature of these disruptions place stress on the body and further risk for long-term consequences. And these long-term consequences could include higher susceptibility to substance abuse, smoking, drinking, infertility, diminished bone density, diminished skin collagen, muscular tears, higher susceptibility to injury, and long-term metabolic and gut damage.
So I don't know about you, JC, but I was a swimmer for about 12 to 13 years. Now I always noticed that if I did not have enough nutrition intake, it would result. I had multiple shoulder issues, back issues, and that just came with the sport, but I could also tell I felt very fatigued after a day if I knew I didn't have enough to eat, or I was kind of focusing, because I was a swimmer, I was always in a swimsuit, I was like, oh, I'm focusing on my body a lot more, and that just kind of caused me to have spiraling thoughts about my body and what it looked like.
Yeah, I was also a swimmer pretty much my whole life, and I think when you're doing 2 hours of cardio every day and you're not putting in the proper fuel for that, you feel it very, very quick. And I wish I could go back in time and just tell myself that I would get so much more out of the sport and probably go so much further in the sport and reach the goals that I had a lot sooner if I let go of what I had looked like and just worried more about what was going to be best for me, like how to fuel myself best and feel better while I'm doing the sport that I loved.
Most definitely, because I feel like that also just drags into our day-to-day lives as well. Like, if we're noticing that in the pool, we're gonna carry that into everyday activities. Like, I knew sometimes that I would think about what I packed for lunch instead of just making sure I had enough nutritious value to it.
Yeah, and we're getting into in just a minute here some of the risks for younger athletes, and I think some of the research that we have on the differences in how restrictive diets manifest in young athletes versus older athletes is really interesting, and we might see coming to light a little bit more those older athletes who started developing these patterns as a young athlete and had managed to go with silent struggle throughout their journey.
Totally. I mean, as we move into the prevalence of eating eating disorders in female athletes. Walter et al. Conducted a study examining the increasing prevalence of eating disorders among adult athletes and certain risks that are common. They used the eating disorder examination questionnaire to measure the symptoms among adolescents, and results showed that 9.6% of female athletes aged 15 to 18 displayed symptoms of an eating disorder, including 6.6 of those female athletes in high-risk sports, which is usually an increased amount of cardio or high impact. And then we'll go into another type of high-risk sport a little bit later. And this is compared to only 2.2% of males exhibiting these symptoms. So we see that there is a much higher prevalence. And these risk factors include like personality factors. They're very gender specific, as we see sociocultural aspects and sports-related pressure that you might get from your team. Especially if you are on team sports, you might be very focused to perform well for your team.
So in this series, we're focusing on female athletes because they're more likely to engage in those restrictive eating patterns and overall more likely to develop eating disorders than male athletes placed in the same environment. So what the research is showing us is that for a lot of young female athletes, the focus is on sports type and body satisfaction, and being satisfied with what they look like, especially within aesthetics and lean sports, as opposed to fueling themselves for the purposes of going further in their sports. And these high-risk sports, which include, as we said, aesthetics, the beauty of movements, physical attractiveness, leanness, is kind of reflecting this cultural idea of thin is going to win. Skylar, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, or a few rounds ago of the Olympics, the Summer Olympics, a lot of gymnastics teams, female gymnastics teams, were coming under fire because the coaches were keeping these girls very small, like on very restrictive diets, and they're growing girls. And thankfully now we see like super strong female gymnasts out there, but this was just reminding me of that a little bit.
Yeah, totally. And even in like this past Olympics, you just hear the commentary, like people are still making comments about athletes' bodies. I notice mainly females instead of males, and if it was males, it's like commenting on how strong and athletic they look, but with females, it is pertaining to their beauty or size, saying like, oh, their size might benefit or hold them back from performing well in whatever sport they're doing.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit about lean sports, which we're going to go in depth into in incoming podcasts. But I think, for instance, like we were talking about swim earlier, swim was definitely a lean sport. And it was interesting. I had the young female experience of it, but I will say that I think the male body image in sports is actually, I think, getting a little bit worse. When I kind of come back and talk to the younger boys who are on the same club swim team that I was on, they seem to be starting to feel similar pressures. So this podcast is focused on female athletes and those results, but that's not to say that this information can't apply to younger male athletes as well.
Totally. And one of the most prevalent sports we've maybe seen eating disorders in is cheerleading, because I'm forgetting the term right now, but the ones who are kind of thrown up into the air.
Flyers.
Right.
Thank
you so much. I feel like they kind of rely on being thin for those specific moves, because you need to be pretty light to be able to be thrown in the air. So research has shown that cheerleaders have a 33.1% risk of developing an eating disorder. In reading that statistic, it does just kind of make sense of me, because when in high school I would see cheerleaders, a lot of them would just talk about either how tired they are, like how much cardio they're going through, and then I had some friends who were cheerleaders, and I knew that they were going through their own eating disorder struggles at the time.
Right, and cheerleading is one of those sports. I think a big part of that is the susceptibility and kind of the way that coaches and cheer programs prime their athletes for that sort of behavior, sort of overworking themselves and creating that competitive environment between each other. But also for student athletes, especially, we have one student cheerleader coming on this podcast who was not experiencing an eating disorder herself, but had such a demanding schedule between classes and athletics, and it was hard to maintain such a high level of nutrition, and it took a toll on her mental and physical health. So that's something that also I think flies under the radar a lot.
Oh, totally. Because in college too, if I mean you're at a new school, but even if you're at a new school that's far from home, you have so much adapting to do. So there may be certain things that do fly under the radar, and I think for a lot of college or not, yeah, non-college athletes and college athletes, eating just might be taken off the table if they're more worried about classes, academics, social life, and just conforming to the societal norms at college. They might overlook maintaining a healthy diet.
Right. And of course, like we were saying earlier, this is not limited to high school and college athletes. We're going to be going a little bit into adult athletes and how these sort of nutritional patterns might be affecting them. So I want to finish off with a bit of a summary for what our coaches and athletes and parents out there can expect to get out of this podcast series. So I did mention we have a student cheerleader, coming onto this podcast to share some of her personal accounts. We also have coaches who can come in and shed some light on warning signs, the prevalence of these different nutrition practices, and potential mitigation strategies. We're also going to have a registered dietitian come in who's going to share with us some of the scientific evidence surrounding malnutrition in athletes. And hopefully we're going to be offering some proactive advice and strategies for coaches and parents to support their athletes, as well as for youth and adult athletes to be able to support their own mental and physical health.
That sounds great, and I know we also have some more research to share. Hearing coaches' outlooks and then sharing those will all be very beneficial for what this podcast has to hold.
Absolutely. We thank everyone for tuning in to our first episode. We will be releasing our second episode in a few days here, and we look forward to seeing you back then.